Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here at St. Alban's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., whether you are here in person or watching us being live streamed or will be viewing the recording at some future time on our website. I am Laura Ingersoll. I'm one of the 4 members of the Memorial Lecture Committee who have put this on for St. Albans, and I just have a few programmatic items before we begin with the program. First, because we're being live streamed, we're going to stick closely to the program timetable, and you have it set out in the printed program that you have. There are 2 15-minute breaks, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. There's coffee and some refreshments in what's called Nurse Hall, which is out through the main church doors to the right and then jog left. And there are also bathrooms there and downstairs. We'll have 1 hour for lunch from 12 to 1. And in the program, it says that you have to have a wristband to get lunch. But we did, we took a leap of faith and we ordered more lunches than we have pre-registrants. So we've dispensed with the wristbands, and there's enough we expect for everyone. They're box lunches. You can sit at the tables across Little Lichgate Road in Satterley Hall, or you can take your box lunch and sit outside, because it's an absolutely gorgeous day, made for Earth Day, and the grounds here are, of course, spectacular. Do, however, please bring the trash back to Satterley Hall so we can properly dispose of it. And be back by 1 o'clock so that we can get started with our first of 2 afternoon panels. Finally, there are question and comment cards in the pews. If you have any question or comment, please fill it out and look for me or one of the other members, and they'll be brought up to be presented to whoever is doing the presentation at the time, whether it's the conversation that's later this morning or the panels in the afternoon. And this afternoon we'll have some young people who will be our question card runners. That is it for logistics. And at this point, I would like to invite our Senior Associate Rector, Emily Griffin, to pray us into the program.
The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Loving God, we thank you for your gifts in creation, for our world, its beauty and its abundance. We pray for all of us who make decisions about the resources of the earth, that we may use your gifts responsibly and honor all that you've made. For those who work on the land or sea, in city or in industry, that they may receive a just return for their labors. For theologians, chefs, journalists, policymakers, activists, and farmers, that through their work we may see your creation afresh. God of peace, let us know that at the heart of turbulence, there is an inner calm that comes from faith in you. Keep us from being content with things as they are, that from this central peace there may come a creative compassion, a thirst for justice, and a willingness to give of ourselves in the Spirit of Christ. May all we say and do today bring honor to you and be good for all your creatures. Amen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, Laura, for being such a stalwart member of this Memorial Lecture Series Committee, a leader for all of us. And I wanted to start with an expression of thanks for your leadership. My name is Gib Kirkham. I also work on the Memorial Lecture Series along with David Brown and Amanda Gilman. And we're delighted to have you here today, and really excited to have the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter with us today to explore faith and food. Dr. Carter has done a lot of his work in this area of the intersection between our faith and how our faith informs our choices. And I think we're all going to be challenged as well as transformed by what he has to say. Of course, you can find Dr. Carter's bio in your program, and I encourage you to read it. One of the things that I've learned over the days that we've been working with Christopher is that he is the eldest of 4 children. One of his brothers lives in DC here. His wife, Gabrielle, encouraged him to seek an undergraduate degree. And I'm personally very grateful for that, because my wife did that for me also, encouraged me to seek higher education. We have connectivity in other ways too. Dr. Carter grew up in Michigan, I grew up in Ohio. And we watched these places really divest themselves of their communities as the economies tanked in the 80s. And that's informed both his thinking and his approach to the topic that we have today. In fact, after graduating in an undergraduate and getting an undergraduate degree in business administration, he went on to pursue a doctorate of theology and an MA in religion, ethics, and then a PhD in religion, ethics, and society. His doctoral dissertation, Eating, Oppression, Food, Faith, and Liberation, was the foundation for his book, The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice, which we have read. I don't know about you, but I found this book extremely challenging, personally, and I think it's challenging for any of us, regardless of race, religion, gender, eating preference. I think what it told me is a journey, a story of a journey towards seeking answers to questions of justice for food workers, caring for the earth and its creatures, and how we can approach food and God's creatures in ways that are consistent with our theological and social values. When I read the opening pages of his book about the gap between our stated beliefs and our actual practice, it stopped me in my tracks. I'm glad that you, Christopher, followed that by saying that this gap is where our humanness lies. And so today's topic is really very perfect for us, for Earth Day, and we're deeply appreciative to you, Christopher, for joining us. And with that, I'll give you the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter.
I wish more people read the preface, because I think that sets the tone for how I'm wanting to approach the book. And in hindsight, if I had, obviously I thank you for mentioning that too. So I didn't start undergrad until I was 24 years old. For me, college was about getting a job. And I in my mind, already had a good job as a grocery store manager in my early 20s. And I was like, I don't need to go to college. And so, as I became a person who decided to go to school and become an academic, I love to read. I realized I had such a passion for reading. And so I would read everything, like from the preface to the end. I'd be looking at footnotes. And I made the assumption that people were like me, and that people would just read the preface. And in hindsight, as I've done this, I'm like, people don't know, like I'm really talking about that gap. And that's why I was so glad you mentioned that, Gib, because that is probably one of my favorite sentences that I wrote in the book, because I think it expresses the reality of humanness, right? And I think it also gestures towards the importance for me of why throughout the text I refer to the important role of compassion over and over again. Because because we are human. Now, I'm also United Methodist. Not, I'm like your, I don't know, maybe cousin. I don't know how you quantify the distinction between Methodist and Episcopal. Very, very, very close. And then in Wesleyan theology, we always talk about this notion of, Christian perfection, this idea of striving towards sanctification. And it's a process of becoming, right? It is a process of becoming, I'd argue, more human, more Christ-like. And so I see this as our notion of humanness as being involved in this process. What are we striving towards? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Let me see if I get out of this. Hopefully this will be, let me turn it off, turn it back on. This is the challenge of, there we go. I had to be right here. So for me, the question that animated my book and animated my research for my graduate education really was, how do we eat in ways that align with our moral and cultural values? I am the grandson of migrant farm workers, particularly my grandfather. He grew up on multiple plantations, a sharecropper, and also just a migrant picker, going from field to field in Brookhaven, Mississippi, so up to Jackson, and down all the way to Louisiana, working in the fields. And so that was his experience. He told stories about that as we got, even from the time I was a child till I got older. And so that was a very visceral, real thing for me, the experience of what it's like to be poor and black in the South in the 1940s. On my father's side of the family, they are Spanish. My grandfather is the first of Carter to be born in America. His father was listed as, on the census, he was white until he married a black woman, and then he became somehow magically mulatto, because this is when they took the census. They came to your place of residence and looked at you and filled it out for you. That's how they did this. And so I said that part of the story because his family, my father's side of the family, were plantation overseers, right? Like literally miles from my mom's side of the family. So I have this lived tension of the European side of my family that was very much a part of a colonial project. In the African side of my family, I was very much a victim of the colonial project. So how do I put these things together? I have all this on my mind, more or less, and I'm driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco to attend this conference, and I'm driving along the 5, and for many of you who don't know, California is now the place where the majority of our agriculture is grown. So much of our produce and our food comes from California. And so I'm driving up this highway, and I begin to look around as we get into the desolate parts of the mid part of California, and I see these huge farms, and I see these shanty towns and shanty housing around them. And it just brought me back to the stories of my grandfather. It brought me back to the stories he said about how he had to experience his difficult life growing up. And me being the person that I am, that's very curious and just comfortable going in places, the benefit of being a 6-foot-tall black man, I'm like, nobody's gonna mess with me, I'll be fine. I go to these towns and start, trying to figure out what's happening and start trying to talk to people in the little bit of Spanish that I do know, and realize that these are all farm workers, and this is farm worker housing. And I immediately began to connect their stories to the stories of my grandfather. And so I want to be clear, for me, this was as much about relationship than anything else. I didn't just magically start thinking about food or farm workers. It became very personal for me. And I believe it's personal for all of us, but it took me having to have this experience to realize that the ways in which my grandfather talked about growing up, which for me felt so much like just 2 steps past slavery, was still happening today. And so as a ethicist, as someone who tries to live in alignment with their beliefs, I knew I had to address this. I couldn't just profess to be a person of faith and not take action upon this. And at the same time, I was already dealing with the
difficulties of being in graduate school, being so far away from home. I mean, I don't know if any of you have been to graduate school, but for me, when going, I somehow convinced my wife for us to take a huge financial step backwards. And so we went from having a decent life to being poor grad students. And so I couldn't fly home and visit home. And so one of the things that allowed me to feel like I was home was eating the food ways of my people, of my family. And for me, red beans and rice always feels like home. It just takes me back to the growing up and the food that my grandmother would make and that my mother would try to make because she wasn't as good as cooking my grandmother, but if she's watching this, she knows, so it's fine. So it's fine. And so I was like, how can I eat in a way where I can still eat the things that I want to eat at the same time being in alignment with my moral and cultural values? I was already seeing the tension. that was leading me down the road of having to change my diet. And so for me, the fear of changing that, the fear of going through that really was just pronounced because I was already so far away from home, and I was already in a space where people felt like I was performing to an extent. And I'll say more about that performance part of humanness later. We're going to hope, there we go. And this is why compassion for me, as I mentioned earlier, is so important. Because what I'm talking about in the book about Black foodways, and today I'll be talking more specifically about foodways in general, it allowed me to recognize that I need to approach the topic with the kind of sensitivity that recognizes the difficulties and the hurdles that we all have when we're talking about changing something so central to our identity as our food. Our food really tells stories of our culture, our people. It tells a story. Cooking together, eating together, all of this notion of family is made evident in the things that we eat. And so I think about compassion as a way of promoting actions that lead to the restoration and flourishing of all people, right? And so if I'm going to think about these issues in a compassionate way, if I'm thinking about my own diet in a compassionate way, how can it lead to flourishing? And how can they particularly pay attention to those who are, as Jesus will call, the least of these? I argue that we need to begin thinking about this kind of dietary changes through the lens of decolonization. Decolonization sounds like a fancy word, but in truth, I'm really trying to take serious the reality of colonialism and the impact that it had on changing, honestly, everything. The invention of race, the invention of, one would argue, I grew up in Michigan, as Gib said. We talked about, I was always taught that the assembly line was, something that Ford invented. But if you look at the history of plantations, I would argue plantation structures are very much about an assembly line kind of structure. Modernity came around during this particular time as we understand it. And so you have to recognize that while many things that emerged in that period are good, it was structured in a way that it created an oppressive hierarchy that elevated certain groups above others. So how do we identify and dismantle the aspects of colonialism that actually harmed our planet, that harmed our biotic community, that harmed us as human beings, right? How do we think about what that reimagination should look like? And so for me, what I try to do in the book and what I do pretty much in all the projects that I write is go about this in four movements: knowing, thinking, being, and doing, right? So I'm like, how do we know what we know to be true? Right? How do we know what we know to be true? That is a legitimate question. What is the basis of our knowing? How do we think about what's happening around us? What is a social analysis? And given our knowing and thinking, who ought we be as people of faith, and what should we do with what we now have learned? Right? And so when I think about it with respect to our foodways, there are two primary assumptions that I want to make sure everybody leaves this room with a understanding of. That our food system, in a sense, is structurally racist. And I'm going to talk more about racism. I'm going to define it because I think it's really important, because many people use the term racism and they don't really define what they mean. I'm going to do a really good description of that. But I want to make sure that you understand, at its essence, what I mean is this two-pronged aspects of our food system. That the goods and harms of our food systems can be traced along racial lines, where people of color bear disproportionate harm and receive less proportionate good. This shouldn't be surprising. This should be pretty evident, even in a place like Washington, D.C. Secondly, racism has enabled these harms to be seen as normal or even deserving because people of the ideological stereotypes projected upon them, projected upon BIPOC communities, that stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities by white people. That's just a way of me saying, like, we normalize this maldistribution because we attribute it to behavior. We attribute it to this is just who they are. This is who these people are. This is what they want to eat, right? And I talk a lot about these particular kinds of ideologies and how these are built around, these ideas are steeped in racialized stereotypes. So addressing the structural racism within our food system requires us to take an honest look at those ideologies that normalize this, the assumptions that go into the way we think about what it is we eat and how we eat. To understand structural evil is to recognize that the story can be told another way. I do this often when we look at stories, right? So one of the ways in which I do this, by way of an example, is the story of Jesus and the woman who's caught in adultery. And you have this whole story about, Jesus and this woman caught in adultery. And I always find it funny because, I'm like, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure when you commit adultery, that is two people. Why is it that Jesus catches the woman? Right? Like, or that the people catch the woman, right? Like there's someone else there that was also committing adultery, right? And so this is the other part of the story. That's what I mean, right? The story can be told in another way. Let us take seriously that other way as a point of analysis, because these ideologies shape memory. With respect to the woman caught in adultery, this fits into a whole mold about women's promiscuity and the ways in which we need to control women's bodies. Somehow men's bodies don't need to be controlled, right, with respect to this kind of interpretation. So this is what I mean, right? So this isn't, I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think it's much of a leap, but it allows us to just ask these questions, right? And so this is going to be a little bit tricky, I think. There we go. Food justice requires us to delink the colonial images and narratives from our historical analysis in order to develop the other side of the story. I love Emily Towns in this book she wrote many years ago called Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil. I use a term from her book in terms of describing how our food system was created with what she calls the white, fantastic, hegemonic imagination, which traffics in people's lives that are caricatured or pillaged, that the imagination that creates the fantastic can control the world in its own image. It is this imagination that helps to hold systemic structural evil in place. And so when I'm talking, so that's big words. White, fantastic, hegemonic imagination. What do I mean? When you talk about a fantastic imagination, you're talking about people who just literally have imagined things that seem almost beyond belief to an extent. Or they project these hyperboles on there. I'm going to talk more about that in literally just a few slides. But hegemonic, I just mean it's pervasive. It's just the pervasive realities. As an example of the white, fantastic, hegemonic imagination as it relates to gender, the idea that somehow women are just confined to the kitchen and women should be doing all the cooking, as if men don't eat, right? Like, these are the things, you're like, well, where does this come from? How does this stereotype emerge, right? That's what we are talking about. We're talking about that as an example. And it holds those kinds of ideas in place. So throughout the book, I should say, I absolutely love to cook. And I didn't realize this until I had to learn how to cook really when I became vegetarian. My grandmother passed away at a young age, unfortunately. She had a really severe stroke. And we weren't wise enough to write down her recipes. And so for me, cooking after my grandmother's death became a way for me to try to remember her through taste. And remember her through the reconstruction of those foods. And I always wonder, because she would have never even thought about making citrus collard greens. We loved eating collards. And so I have, remixed these things in ways, and I'm always curious as to what she would have thought about these particular kinds of things. And it's emotionally complex, right? It's emotionally complex to do this kind of recreation, to think about and to change some of those historical ways and patterns of consumption, to take ham out of something and put in raisins in orange juice, fundamentally different, right? But to really recognize that it's for the pursuit of justice, right? And I say that to say, as I said earlier, I want to be clear. I'm not arguing that Western and European or white ways of knowing are like evil. What I am saying is they have a Eurocentric and androcentric bias, meaning they have a European and male-centered bias. That just means that the assumptions are limited. Now that they're all wrong, I use quite a bit of, I won't say quite a bit, I use several European theologians and writers in my own work, but I also have the majority of my people I reference in the book are women of color for a reason, right? Because I want to expand the way in which I'm talking about these things. Now, one question I have, and I normally would do a Q&A where I ask people to respond to this, but we don't have time, but I want to ask these questions for you to just think. When we're talking about ideas and assumptions around our foodways and how they developed. For those of you who can remember, in primary school, what was the rationale given about why Africans were enslaved? Like, think about that question. What was the reasoning that you learned why black people were enslaved? And secondly, when or if you learned about black history, what did your teacher start with? Now, these questions, I asked them for very specific reasons, because I want you to begin to think about the ways in which you were introduced to black people and how that introduction can therefore shape your assumptions that flow from that experience and what you project upon black people. Most of the time, we are taught that black people were enslaved because they were just sold to us or captured or conquered or spoiled of war, or they were very good laborers, they were more docile, they could be controlled. Like, it's those kinds of reasons generally given about why Africans were enslaved, right? They were just the people that could be controlled. And if you learned about black history, often you either learn about black people in America from enslavement, so the beginnings of it is when they were enslaved, or you learn about it from the civil rights movement. So the beginnings of it is through the lens of people like Dr. Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks. And what is, I think, interesting, or I shouldn't say interesting is the right word, problematic about this particular kind of assumption is what that tells people that look like me growing up around or about black people is that anything that our history is only relevant in as much as it relates to white people. So all that happened before enslavement, the preservation of Aristotle, the creation of calculus, right? All the things that happened in Africa, that history somehow doesn't exist or doesn't count. Doesn't matter, right? The botanical legacy of this culture doesn't matter if it's not taught or not made as seen as though that is important and valid, just as valid as Greek or Roman history that you would learn. Or you are taught that your humanness is only going to matter if you can live up to who I would argue is one of the best humans that have ever been created in the world, and people like Martin Luther King. That's an impossible standard of humanness for any of us to uphold. Right? And so these are the things that inform some of our knowledges around black people writ large. And so when we're thinking about African agriculture, what I want you to understand is that there's a particular kind of what I call a convenient omission, is that African agriculture and animal husbandry knowledge was critical to the colonial food system, right? That omission, it breathes life into the myth and assumption that enslaved Africans had no legitimate knowledge except for what they were taught by their white enslavers. Because the truth is, black people were enslaved, Africans were enslaved from particular tribes to grow particular crops because they had a particular kind of agricultural and animal expertise, right? Such that depending on where your ancestors can be traced from, what part of the country they are from, and the crop they grew, you can probably have like a 75% chance of figuring out what part of Africa your ancestors came from. For any of you that are from the Carolinas, the likelihood is that you come from the Senegambia region, because that's the kind of rice that was cultivated in Africa that was then cultivated in North and South Carolina. From a capitalist perspective, this makes sense. You are acquiring laborers who can grow your product at the level of excellence, right? But what we've been taught is that somehow we make this assumption that these black people were enslaved and they didn't know anything, and that the colonizer just taught them everything. when that's actually fundamentally the opposite of what happened, right? And so a part of what I try to do in this project with respect to Black foodways is, for me, there's a reclaiming of wisdom and knowledge that I think needs to take place when we're talking about what it means to think about agricultural and animal husbandry from a Black perspective. And earlier when I was talking about that fantastic imagination, it really began, or one way I should say it shouldn't begin, this is one way to think about it, is the ways in which you can see people talking about African and Black foodways. So there's a quote from a Louisiana journalist that I have in here. This is a picture from the, what's plantation? It's escaping me. A plantation in just north of New Orleans. Whitney. It is Whitney Plantation. One of the best plantations to go visit. Plantations are tough places to visit. I did it for the research. But out of all the ones I visited, this one was the best in terms of presenting life from the perspective of the majority of people who were on that land. I'll just say that. And so this Louisiana journalist, he writes, the Negro is born to cook. He can neither read nor write, and therefore he could not learn from books. He was simply inspired. The God of the spit and the saucepan had breathed into him. That was enough. That's what I mean by it. Fantastic. Just this huge idea. Like, Black people just magically come out of the womb, throwing spices, and just magically we can cook, And like, that doesn't make any sense. But that was the assumption. That was the assumption they were projecting upon this food. And to be clear, there were different kinds of seasonings that Black people did use that clearly Europeans did not, right? Some of that there's lots of health reasons why that was taking place. And so when Europeans begin to taste this, they're like, wow, this is something amazing, it's something different. But it does little to tell the story about why that was taking place. It's just this projected assumption. And so what happens is you have this way of thinking about Black foodways as at least gifted, at least talented. It honors the talent and work of these people. But then after the Civil War, you see this shift, right? You see a particular kind of shift with respect to the ways in which people talk around Black foodways. I'm going to zoom in on each of these images here in just a moment, hopefully. There we go. And so what we see here is a postcard with a newspaper caricature that says, this caption reads, "Two souls but with a single thought." And so it's this idea of a poor Black boy and what's called a zip coon. A zip coon is supposed to be a emancipated Black person who has some money, who dresses nice to appear white, but in reality, it's all about performance, and it's not really, he can't live up to the reality of what it means to be a civilized, fully civilized person. And this image makes the projection that they can't focus on anything other than chicken, just their base human desires. That's what drives Black men. And you see that chicken metaphor get played out with respect to white women. So this idea that white women, right, are meat, are chicken. And it presents this whole, this narrative that we need to protect white women from Black men, right? And that plays out in all kinds of ways right now, in terms of the ways in which police talk and encounter Black women, but also, or Black men and white women, and the ways in which you have, it tries to manipulate white women into buying into a kind of rhetoric that ultimately disempowers them. If any of you have ever read the book or seen the movie Just Mercy, you really get the idea of what I'm talking about. That basically encapsulates this whole image right here. This is a restaurant literally called the Coon Chicken Inn. And that's the image of the restaurant where you go inside the doors through a black zip coon. And that's the image of the menu. The idea is that Black men love chicken so much, they know how to find good chicken and cook good chicken. If you want the best chicken, this is the kind of place you would go. That was the myth around Black people and Black foodways. So you see this shift, right? It becomes one from just this way of which you're talking about their intelligence, that's natural, to maybe it's actually just their base desires with respect to men. And to be clear, this also gets projected upon women as well. You have the Mammy caricature where this Black woman is super happy to be cooking for her white children, right? That she loves them so much, she'd be so happy to cook for her white children. This image, when you read the caption, these white women are coming to a retreat, and they're nervous about the food. They go in the kitchen, they see this Black woman there, and they are like, oh my gosh, we're totally fine. We know the food's gonna be good, just look at her. We know she can cook just by looking at her, right? This particular kind of projection. And also, to be clear, this happens to everybody, not just black people, right? When we talk about the chicken metaphor, you're dealing with the ways in which women's bodies are seen as pieces of meat. This is an actual image from a pork manufacturing catalog. It got famous from Carol Adams' book, The Sexual Politics of Meat. It's the first time I came across this image. But this is a way in which they're talking about conflating women's bodies and animal bodies, right? We see this also with respect to Asian communities, right? This has really got popular as a consequence of World War II in the ways in which you had a lot of Japanese anti-Asian sentiment in general, as we see happening, as a consequence of the pandemic. And the kinds of language, the imagery, all this stuff that would pop up and beyond there. The indigenous kind of image, right? Oh, this indigenous woman is so happy just to give you butter. She just wants to make sure, on her knees somehow that this is the best kind for you. And Trader Joe's went all in on racism and just wanted to do it like, they had Trader Jose, Trader Giotto, Trader Josan, and Trader Ming's. And so, they eventually went away from doing this, but I want to put this up here just so you know, this still happens. They stopped doing this, I want to say I think as a consequence of the protests in 2020. So I think it started in 2021. So very, very recently, right? So I'll say more about this stuff later. I'm not going to say anymore. Maybe y'all have some questions about that too, because if you just try to look at racial stereotypes in food, you come across some interesting things. But the point of all this really is about preserving this fantastic imagination that's projected upon people. Non-European foods have been projected as simple and healthy, worldly and barbaric, because the fantastic white imagination wanted people to believe that non-white people were simple, unhealthy, worldly, and barbaric. More importantly, they wanted these communities to believe that description was accurate. They wanted people to think that the particular way of eating healthy is steeped in whiteness. One of the stories I don't have in the book, when I got a job, that's the first time I was a senior pastor. This was in the same time, so the fall of 2010. All this stuff was happening around the same time, and it converges. And working at this church in Compton, and the women in that church, and conversations with them, they're starting to eat some of the foods I'm making that's vegetarian, and I realized many of them do not eat meat, but do not call themselves vegetarian. Not that was so strange. I was like, and what I found out through conversations with them was for them, they understood vegetarian to be so wrapped in whiteness, they couldn't conceptualize themselves as vegetarians. That's something white people do. It's not what we do. And these are older black women who come from mostly Louisiana and Texas and immigrated to California. So this is still, again, alive and well, this kind of projection about what it means to be healthy. So what do we do? How do we begin to push back against this? We begin by reclaiming these foodways that de-link from the ideologies projected upon them. We reread these images. We cut out the nonsense. And then we ask ourselves, from her perspective, what kind of pride might she have in the bird that she's cooking? What kind of pride does she have that maybe she was providing for her family? What did she bring to that kitchen that centered her experience rather than the experience of the white gaze, right? You take seriously people's collective history as you reread these images. Now, when we're talking about from a political perspective, right, thinking, now that we have this knowledge, what do we do in terms of how we think about this? We go back to those underlying assumptions, race and racism, right? How does that influence the international food politics that we deal with and that we have today? I was telling Gib earlier, I have a couple of newer parts of the lecture that I wrote more or less for y'all. And so I'm going to have to read this because this is stuff that's new. But I want to be clear as we move into this broader conversation today that all of these things are wrapped up in a theological framework, and that'll kind of become more evident as we go. Early on in my academic career, most of the environmental scholarship I encountered explicitly or tacitly endorsed a Descartesian dualistic view of the human person, an understanding of the self that exists outside of and apart from non-human nature, something along the lines of I think, therefore I am. And while this human nature binary existed well before the invention of race, race as a concept made it such that the boundaries between human beings and nature needed to be policed to preserve the hierarchical status of the human, or more precisely, the white, cisgendered, heterosexual, upper-class man. Mainstream environmental scholarship does not explain how the maintenance of mainstream environmental scholarship does not explain how the maintenance of the human nature binary is critical for the maintenance of white body supremacy. I use the term white body supremacy to draw attention to the ways in which the ideology of white supremacy renders all non-white bodies, be they human or other than human animals, as objects. As such, scholars who do not attend to race in their ecological work, all the while arguing for the elimination of the human nature binary and the subsequent oppressive hierarchies that flow from it, they fail to understand the depth of the challenge they are undertaking. Asking white people to give up their ideological commitment to the human nature binary is in this way similar to asking white people to give up the idea of whiteness. And we see how well that is going. Environmental practices are always racialized, and racializing practices are always environmental. Housing is an environmental practice, and who gets to live where, deeply, deeply tied to the environment. And yet, the majority of white environmental scholars write in such a way that I'm led to believe they do not see race as one factor, or that they see race as one factor among many that ought to be explored when thinking about the environment. And what I want to suggest to you all today is that one cannot begin to understand ecology and the climate catastrophe we are facing without understanding how racism, colonialism, and imperialism have brought us here. These are the most important points of analysis because of the ideology of white body supremacy runs deep. As theologian Willie James Jennings notes in his book Christian Imagination, Theology and Origin of Race, the idea of whiteness rendered any narrative of self-identity bound to geography, trees, or animals as unintelligible. He writes, with the emergence of whiteness, identity was calibrated through the possession of, not the possession by, specific land. People would henceforth and forever carry their identities on their bodies. From the beginning of the colonialist moment, being white placed one at the center of the symbolic and real reordering of space. The idea of race required removing place as the central marker of one's identity and replacing place with the pigmentation of one's body. One could be French, Spanish, English, or Portuguese, but for the idea of race to stick, the landscapes of their white bodies needed to take precedence over the landscapes of their home countries as the primary means of classifying and organizing the human body. By delinking notions of self-identity from the landscapes and tying them to human bodies, the idea of race should be understood as both a social, cultural, and ecological event. My approach to doing ecology by centering the lives of BIPOC communities and non-human nature is important because it helps call attention to the inconsistencies and false equivalencies made by environmentalists and activists and environmental agencies. One of those false equivalencies is the way we use the term Anthropocene. In an article published in the Global Change newsletter in the year 2000, the atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen and ecologist Eugene Stormer suggested that a new epoch should be added to the geological timescale, the Anthropocene. In a follow-up essay, Crutzen goes on to note that in the last 3 centuries, the Earth is operating at a no-analog state. In his words, the Earth system has recently moved well outside the range of natural variability and exhibited over at least the last 500,000 years. And the nature of change now occurring simultaneously in the Earth system, their magnitudes and rates of change are unprecedented and unsustainable. He concludes this essay by moving to a deeper point of both articles on the Anthropocene by arguing for responsible use of our environmental resources. Indeed, for one of the pioneers of the term Anthropocene, what we see here is the term was devised to and employed in part to provoke meaningful response among public to change their way of life and prevent environmental catastrophe. What motivates people to change? What motivates societies to change? What makes change sustainable? Philosophers, theologians, psychologists and neuroscientists have spent an incalculable amount of time to discern an answer to those questions. My answer is rather simplistic, but anyone who has recovered from addiction knows or is familiar with what I'm going to say. Before we can change the thinking that informs our doing, we first have to admit that we have a problem. If we are going to change our habits, we have to be confronted with the concrete reality that the only other alternative to change is death. And as it relates to the problem of global climate change, we must recognize that some whom we love, some of our family and friends will also struggle with the same, some of our friends and family who struggle with the same carbon addiction that we do. Some of them will choose death rather than change. We must not let those who fail to see the reality of our climate crisis persuade us that choosing death is somehow a sign of strength and bravery. Some of you may be wondering who I am referring to when I say this we. Who is this mysterious we that needs to admit they have a problem or that they have a problem they need to change? Our ability to answer this question will go a long way in determining if our grandchildren will find this planet habitable. Indeed, if we are going to inspire those responsible for our current ecological crisis to change, we must be very precise about who they are. And this is why the term Anthropocene, while helpful in identifying that humans are shaping our current geological epoch at unprecedented rates, doesn't go far enough in identifying the groups of humans most responsible for our current predicament. The term Anthropocene presents us with what I call the illusion of accountability. It is being deployed to obscure and shield those who need to be held accountable for anthropogenic climate change if we are to choose life over death. And make no mistake, this is the choice that we are making. As such, it is urgent that we stop using the term Anthropocene in isolation as a way to passively suggest that all humans are equally responsible for our current climate crisis. Anthropocene can no longer be a means of language evasion where those who are most responsible for our current crisis are not explicitly positioned as moral agents and decision makers. This does not mean that we abandon the term Anthropocene altogether. Indeed, for those of us who live in the West or what we might call developed nations, there is merit to use the term regardless of our racialization because all of us have a disproportionate impact on our climate relative to folks who live in what we might call undeveloped nations. However, I suggest that when we use the term Anthropocene in our writing and speaking, we make it clear that certain human groups, predominantly men, predominantly Euro-American men, and multinational corporations whose boards are made up of a combination of the two, played a disproportionate role in creating our current climate crisis. According to the Climate Accountability Institute, just 20 corporations are responsible for 1/3 of all carbon emissions. Just 100 companies are responsible for 70% of the global carbon emissions. If we're going to change our ways, if the political leadership of our various countries who are predominantly male and operate under the capitalist logic of whiteness are going to be persuaded to change, then we must be confronted with the concrete reality of our role in moving our planet into our current epoch. We must view accountability as a sign of courage rather than a sign of weakness. We must view accountability as a sign of wisdom rather than a sign of capitulation. I think this is most manifest in the ways in which we talk about farming, in the ways we can talk about the ways in which this impacts domestic domestic agriculture. We take seriously what used to be called the Farm Bill in the ways in which we have it disproportionately privileging those corporations, where 15% of the 85% of the money in the Farm Bill goes to 15% of the farmers, right? So it's a very small percentage of these corporate farmers get the vast majority of the money, right? That's what that 85-15 split means. Particularly with respect to black farmers, what I write in the book is that black people were meant to be tillers of the land, but never owners. And this has been the overarching sentiment held by the USDA toward black farmers. And Melanie, this is the sentiment that emerged from the story I told you earlier about my grandfather. Like, this is the way in which black farmers have been treated. I had some hope under the Biden administration that initially they had carved out, which there's no other word to use, reparations for black farmers. Unfortunately, white farmers were so resistant to it that they sued in Wisconsin, and it went to the Supreme Court. And what the Biden administration decided to do was to, in order to avoid the lawsuit, was to put it in the into the Inflation Reduction Act to include white farmers. The white farmers argue that they could admit that the economic racism took place, but they didn't feel they should be held accountable for the mistakes of their ancestors. So essentially, they commit mistakes, but they say, well, no one should be held accountable for the mistakes that happened, and that took place. When you think about this from a global perspective, we recognize that we see the same markers of power and race operating as well. Raj Patel, who's an Indian food justice activist who currently is at the University of Texas, argues that the mechanics of setting up our global food system involve the twin process of colonization and the forced creation of markets, whether it be through the general agreed on trade and tariffs, the World Trade Organization, or structural adjustment programs are all created in these kinds of broad ways to ensure trade takes place and flows smoothly from the global south in marginalized countries to the global north. All of these programs are structured in such a way that they benefit America and Europe, essentially. We see this also taking place in transnational agri-food corporations that essentially own the entire process from field to fork. This is why when we have a crisis that took place during the pandemic, we have huge supply chain issues because you have one corporation that owns the entire supply chain, right? And so this is what causes those kinds of problems when they own everything from field to fork. You also see that they argue that other countries should actually have a true free market without the subsidies that we give to our current farmers. Somehow those farms can be okay. I mentioned earlier a lot about racism, and I was going to define it. So this is what I want to do here is to kind of conceptualize or crystallize what I mean when I'm talking about racism. I think of racism structurally in these three spheres reinforcing each other. To draw a distinction between someone like myself and maybe someone who you all may be familiar with, someone like Ibram Kendi. In Kendi's diagram, if you were to make one, he wouldn't have ideologies. He would just talk about politics and economics, and that these two things kind of reinforce an overall project of disproportionate power. I think being a religious person, I understand the power and reality of our beliefs and how our beliefs influence our actions. And so what I mean by racism, I'm talking about, from economic perspective, how inequality can be traced along racial lines, economic inequality, political inequality, and those ideas, right, a set of values and beliefs that normalize and ultimately moralize those particular kinds of inequalities. I want to show you how these work and actually put them up, maybe, at some point. We did a run through, and this worked totally fine earlier. And somehow, I knew it was just kind of how it happens. I have to hold it in like the best spot. Actually, I can stop right here. So we're talking about enslavement. Economically, what happens is you have African labor seen as chattel. Generational wealth created for capitalist farm landowners, essentially, that the people who did the work don't have access to. Hegemonic political power for mostly white men, because political power in America is mostly tied to the ownership of land, particularly early on. Ideologically, this was supported because black people or people of color were seen as less intelligent. In truth, they were seen as less human than whites, as we'll talk about momentarily. Farming. Black farmers were denied funding or given higher interest rates or poor loan terms with respect to the acquisition of land. There is a serious degree of systemic land theft that took place with black farmers. Politics. You have a loss of political power because white people owned the land and therefore marginalized black voting power. Ideologies, you have black people were meant, again, to till the land, not to own the land. If you're thinking about grocery food access, I started with ideology here because I think it's important for us to recognize the assumptions that black people are not healthy and won't eat healthy food because it's, quote unquote, their culture. That reinforces ideas that, from an infrastructure perspective, saying that building in black communities is a bad investment, therefore food in those communities are more expensive. Politically, this results in deed restrictions, which basically are policies that allow grocery stores to not be, for a grocery store to leave a community and not be replaced, to encourage people to go to the new location of the store. So it creates food apartheid. It creates spaces where people don't have access to food, where it didn't need to happen or where it needed to be. Politically, it's important for us to take seriously the reality of factory farms and how you have a racial caste system in this space, right? Most people ignore what's taking place in these factories, but I want to be clear, to be fair, this is how the food system is designed to operate. We consumers are not supposed to think about where our food comes from. We're not supposed to think about the people who work in these factories or in the fields that are growing the food. an amazing article in the New York Times that came out many years ago called "In a Slaughterhouse, Some Things Never Die." They talk about the realities of a Smithfield plantation in Smithfield, North Carolina, and how you have this particular kind of racial hierarchy and how that gets played out and the resentments that build over time. In Waterloo, Iowa, during the COVID-19 pandemic, you saw there's a gambling ring that the management had where they were placing bets on who would get COVID next and among their workers, basically betting on who would live and die, and they got caught, right? And this is during the COVID-19 pandemic, so again, very, very recently. And so that just tells you the degree to which they took these lives very loosely, didn't take it seriously. So what do we learn when we think about that? What new knowledge have we gained? How might we begin to think through the decolonization of our food systems? First, we identify the areas where we see coloniality operating, and then we begin to explore and create alternative models from which we can feed ourselves. This is the goal. But before we do that, we have to ask ourselves, fundamentally as people of faith, what posture from which are we going to engage this work? How are we going to do it? From the perspective of Christian theology, the challenge, I believe, or I should say the vegan cornbread that I talk about in the book, reminds us that we are a part of a greater body of life. All life is interconnected, all life has sacred worth, and we are moving towards the ethic of oneness, right? So the posture from which we're supposed to create these new alternatives comes from the collective understanding that we express when we have Holy Communion, right? The idea that we are all part of the body, and that if anyone is not, as I say in my liturgy, I don't know if y'all say anything like this, but I talk about in the liturgy when I perform communion that if anyone is denied access to the table, if we place boundaries around the table that denies someone's humanness, they feel like they cannot be at this table and be the full expression of who they are, then we are not authentically participating in table fellowship. We are not truly invoking the realities of the Spirit of Jesus in this kind of boundary-breaking love, right? That's what we mean we're talking about the bread of life. It is all life. So how do we take that seriously? One thing is to recognize all too often we've placed the value of life and we've tied it to the value of whiteness. So this is an image of a protest in Memphis, Tennessee, about integration, I should say, school integration. And what we see here are these signs, you know, I'm not anti-Negro, we're anti-race mixing. This woman right here with the smirk on her face, her sign reads, racial intermarriage begins with children holding hands in the first grade. Somehow she figured it out. That's what happens. Like that's when I figured it out. That's when it is. Like first grade, hold hands, boom. You got a bunch of interracial stuff going on. The crazy thing though is the girl behind her, right? A couple of girls behind her. Her sign, which I know you can't read because it's too blurry over here, but she says the sign talks about how God kept the races separate for a reason. And I always think about that is what an image I find haunting. Because this is what she's being taught, right? Like she didn't come out the womb thinking this. This is what she's being taught. And how much reprogramming we have to do with the young people today with respect to understanding who they are and the reality of who they are. And so we have this notion, it causes us to take seriously the reality that since colonialism, the human, what we talk about when we say human, really is wrapped up as a projection of this white imagination, rendering human virtually synonymous with white men, right? You have this way in which people, when they talk about what it means to be human, we see this in medicine, for those of you who maybe practice medicine, right? That's the most obvious place I would say, where the majority of the medicines that are developed and practiced on primarily white men as the subjects. So women especially have huge discrepancy. Women are fundamentally hormonally different than men. And so they make these medicines, they're like, well, they're probably gonna work pretty good on women, more or less, right? And you see this in the reality of our women's healthcare. Like if you look at maternal mortality, you look at all these things that are set up that like, why do women have these kinds of health problems in America that they don't have in other countries? It's in part because of the ways in which we think about performing medicine or performing these things on humans, and how much of our assumptions around humans are rooted in a male-centered kind of bias. This is particularly true within Christianity, as is evident in the kind of language we often use metaphorically to talk about God, and how God is often seen and understood as masculine kind of way when, God is not an embodied human. Hopefully, I'm sure y'all know that already, right? I say that to be clear, like, God is not a human. And so, it is a spirit. So this is the challenge. It's like we have to think about God not as a human, but that's often not the way we think about it, or talk about it at least. And so when we talk about decolonizing this notion of the human, requires a view of being human, what I call as praxis, a process. Sanctification is really what I'm talking about. The process of learning and unlearning and applying and realizing our humanness in anti-impressive ways. Our humanness is really a journey towards being like Christ. One thing we have to take seriously is the reality that much of our notion of what it means to be human is rooted on an idea of social Darwinism, right? This idea that Europeans were teaching other people of color what it means to be a good kind of human, as you see in this image of the Uncle Sam teaching the colonized countries this. What's often happened is liberation theologians or racial justice activists would argue that we're human too. That was their argument. Now people have argued that we are human too, but what I suggest is that being just as human as white people does little to deconstruct the racism, sexism, and ecological extractivist thinking that normalizes oppression in the ways in which they have defined human. So in this sense, when someone disparages a group of human beings as animals or animalistic, they do not mean that the group of people fall outside the scientific category of Homo sapiens. Rather, they are stating that these humans do not look, live, worship, or reason normally, where normal is understood as Eurocentric white norms. You see this in church politics too, when people would visit different churches. They're like, oh, that was a little bit weird. That didn't feel normal. I remember I would have my students, I would teach them to go visit these different churches to experience what another version of normal might be, right? And so in this sense, when one does not act white or behave in ways that challenge white dominance, they are seen as an animal. We saw this in the rhetoric of former President Donald Trump. He still does this all the time. But to be clear, this is still happening right now. This is a quote of what's happening in Antioch, California, where you have a police chief, and they were describing and talking about black communities, black people they were going to arrest, and using the same kind of animalistic, racially coded language, talking about chicken, talking about Kool-Aid and watermelon, those kind of stereotypes. This stuff still is very, very pervasive in our government and in our policing force in this country, right? White supremacy creates a hierarchy based on race and skin color and equates the idealized human with whiteness. And so what I'm arguing is that an open acceptance of the negative status of the animal, which means like if you view animality as something that is less than, right? It's a tacit acceptance of the hierarchical racial system of white supremacy in general. This means our modern delineation of human and humanity and animal and animality reconstructed along racial lines. So we've come to understand what it means to be a human is fundamentally constructed opposed to animals. This isn't new to black people or people of color. We've been dealing with people calling us animals of some sort for a long time. Intellectually, we know this. What I'm arguing is the way in which we've critiqued it has had some particular kinds of flaws, right? What I'm saying is the methodological reasoning that normalizes racism and white supremacy does not discriminate based on species. It's the same reasoning. It's a body supremacy. I'm not suggesting that the oppression and exploitation of non-human animals are the same as those of human beings. It's not. It's different. Objectively, it's different. But that doesn't matter. It is suffering, right? It is oppression, and it is premised upon a kind of white body supremacy. It is from the same kind of logic. So I'm arguing that the exploitation of non-human animals normalizes a colonial theological anthropology that ultimately normalizes anti-black racism. The ways in which we think about the treatment of animals fundamentally influences how we think about the treatment of black people. Because black people, anti-black racism is so steeped and tied to animality that we have to take that seriously. This is an implicit theological anthropology, an implicit way we're taught about what it means to be human. We are implicitly taught and socialized to accept the normative structure of Christianity that places humans as the pinnacle of creation. Racial formation ensures that the human is understood to be white. Patriarchy ensures that he is male. Heterosexism and ableism ensures that he is straight and able-bodied. So we have to attend to this broken theological anthropology. Otherwise, when we strive to be full human beings within this flawed structure, we're replicating a way of being human that is fundamentally flawed. So how do we do that? How do we go about thinking about this? For me, I construct a new theological anthropology, an understanding of what it means to be human in light of these norms. So I talk about who we're called to be, how we're called to live, and what are we called to do. The norm that makes this anthropology decolonial is that all creation has sacred worth and no created being should be exploited in the eyes of God. This norm has shaped my reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan. As I talked about earlier, I was talking, I can't remember who I was talking to, because I've talked about this a few times. For Jesus in the Gospels, he talks about sin as a failure to bother to love. That's how I define. Often in progressive churches, we don't talk a lot about sin. We're like, sin, because many of us have the trauma of growing up in spaces, or maybe it wasn't quite as progressive. Maybe people use the language of sin to really manipulate folks. And I grew up in that space. And what I've come to realize through my training and through therapy and through healing of this other kinds of ways is that when you look at the Gospels, the way Jesus talks about sin, it's not about just following of the 10 Commandments, right, that people want to put up in schools. It's really about a failure to follow the Beatitudes. That somehow, mysteriously, they're not arguing to put the Beatitudes in school. You know, the idea of blessed are the poor. You know, we don't want to teach them the Beatitudes. We want just this kind of Old Testament kind of way of thinking about God. But anyway, I digress. I don't get too far off topic because I got to wrap up. What I mean by sin is a failure to bother to love, you look at what Jesus is critiquing when he's critiquing the priest and the Levite. What he's saying is they go past this wounded person and they have the ability to do something, but they don't bother to care. They have the ability, but they fail to show love. And in this sense, that's how I get to this point of saying that all creation has sacred worth. They looked at this wounded person and thought, they're not worthy enough for me to help. Right? And so the invitation for us is to not fail to love. And that feels like it should be something we all can get on board, that we all can say, yes, I shouldn't fail to love. This is a hard standard when you define what love is, but it's a standard we should all strive towards and should be activated and animated to strive towards, right? In Scripture, sin resides in our strengths more so than our weaknesses, right? Meaning that it's when we have the ability to do something, but we choose to not do something, right? That is where we find the fact that where we find sin wrapped up in. I start this process by taking seriously the creation narratives, right? I should say, why do I use creation narratives? Why do I do that? Well, Scripture has a vital role, right? These verses carry 100 years of misinterpretation, and we have to recognize that a lot of people read the creation narratives like Michelangelo, as coming from a Eurocentric perspective, right? So we have to take seriously this kind of what a reinterpretation might cause us to rethink about this notion of creation, what it actually means to reinterpret them in ways that center interdependence between all created life. Biblical scholars read these texts as poetry, right? That allows us to have more imagination because we know poems have a surplus of meaning. We recognize that both of these stories tell us more than perhaps we've taken out of them. So if you take seriously what happens in Genesis 1 in dominion, that's one of the passages people are like, dominion, I don't know. It gives people the reasoning that they've used to exploit the land. But in truth, when you look at dominion and take it from a serious way and actually look at what it says when you translate into Hebrew, the words we just translate to dominion, subdue and or mastery, they connote a special responsibility given to humans to use power in non-oppressive means. Non-oppressive means. In non-oppressive means, it's all about relationship. It's like you have to tend and care. If you don't, you will be kicked out. That was the point. So it was you have that power, but you have to use it responsibly. Spider-Man, with great power come great, y'all know that quote. Yeah. It's basically the same thing, just like Spider-Man, Genesis 2:15, the Lord God took the human and put him in the garden to till and keep it. The Tanakh translates to till and keep to till and tend. I love that translation. And so when we read both verb meanings in mind, we can read the text as stating that a distinctive part of the human vocation in caring for earth is to both keep and serve the garden, to learn from it while respecting its limitations. What we have in the Garden of Eden is what I would call a realistic utopia. There's suffering in the garden. There's death, right? Like there's nature is alive in the garden. But what the Garden of Eden, the story is about a limited freedom. right? Freedom within limits. And this really is at the heart of what a lot of political struggle right now. We have folks on one side who want a limitless freedom to do whatever they want. But the garden, God says you can do anything, but you can't eat this. I'm going to place a limit around your freedom. Can you live with limits of your freedoms to recognize the importance of solidarity among all your fellow creatures? That is the point of that story, or I shouldn't say the point, one of the points of that story. And for me, that is an amazing place to build a foundation on the kind of ethics that I tend to create in those three norms of self-love, or the three norms, the first of which is self-love. For me, that's rooted in this idea of the Imago Dei, recognizing that we are created in the image of God. And for people of color, I would argue for women, embracing the divine command to love ourselves is crucial because it allows communities to begin to heal from the residue of colonialism, internalized racism, colorism, dehumanization, and the animalization of our bodies, right? Recognizing that we too are worthy of love, that we should see ourselves as bearing God. If we are called to love God with all our heart, our mind, our soul, and our strength, what does that mean for loving ourselves, recognizing that we bear that image within us? Solidarity. A decolonial theological anthropology aims to foster relationships that mimic the life and teachings of Jesus. Not that Jesus, this Jesus. I want to be clear. There's two different ones, you know? And this is the challenge. I mean, you can look around this building. We see those images, right? I can tell you the majority of people that are saints that are in this space come from the Middle East. They don't look like that. They look more like this. And I dealt with this a lot in my Roman Catholic institution. And I'm not saying you need to change all your windows, but I am saying we have to think about what that is teaching visually, right? About whiteness. About who's doing the saving. That is teaching something. We can't pretend that it's not, right? And so I argue that this solidarity extends to non-human animals, non-human nature as well, when the harm is unnecessary for our survival. We see this, I would argue, in the Gospels, because when you actually read it, Jesus doesn't eat a lot of animals. But I'll talk about that later. So, to be clear, I had it set up separately for people of color and for white people, because I think what these norms, how they get lived out, should look different based upon your context. And self-love for Euro-American people, I would argue, begins by taking seriously what Paul wrote in Philippians. This notion of mirroring Jesus is by emptying oneself of the colonial assumptions that frame their self-understanding, by exploring and discovering who you are outside of coloniality in order to love their self. This means, as I talked earlier about the ways in which whiteness is predicated on de-linking from the land, for you to re-link to your place, right? What does it mean for you to understand yourself as a maybe DC native, or maybe understand your ancestry from a particular country, and identifying deeply within that rather than this structure of whiteness that creates this oppositional binary that had to exist, blackness, right? What does solidarity look like for those folks, right? It begins by cultivating a critical consciousness that decenters the white experience as the truth. Rather, it centers BIPOC social and theological reflections. At its best, this leads to renewal and reconciliation of relationships between white people and those whom their ancestors have harmed. It also requires what I call anamnesis, the intentional remembering of the exploited, marginalized, and minoritized victims of their historical and ancestral legacy of exploitation. While none of us are at fault for the mistakes and misdeeds or evil actions of our ancestors, we now bear the responsibility of reconciliation so that we can begin to heal from the wounds of the past. Somebody has to be responsible. That is upon us to take responsibility for those mistakes. This is hard. I don't want to pretend that some of you are probably just like, I don't know about what this guy's saying, but I'm going to be nice and smile because he seems like he's a good dude, of which I appreciate. But I want to suggest to you, rather than just being nice and smile, much of the work that I write about, I talk about compassion, comes from, I would consider myself much more of a contemplative and mystic. And it comes across in other things, and subtly in this book. I talk a lot about using compassion, this particular practice that requires us to take a U-turn. So I'm telling you to not dismiss those feelings. Those feelings are valid. But to turn inward and say, why do I feel this way when he's talking about something that makes me uncomfortable? What is it that's going on within me? Because often what happens is people project their on other people. You're making me uncomfortable. Rather than saying, why am I uncomfortable? What is it within me? What do I need to attend to? And this is not a way of judgment. What I want you to do is hold it in compassionate care. Recognize that part of you that's uncomfortable has a kernel of wisdom. It's trying to help you. It's trying to prevent you from feeling hurt. And so tend to it. What is underneath that? Let it be as a guidepost to help you identify the assumptions that perhaps have gotten triggered through some kind of fear or something from the past. By compassionately attending to our fears, those parts of ourselves that get reactive, we are then able to gain a critical distance from those reactivities to examine the unmet need that gave rise to them. Lastly, holistic interdependence is accepting that we're created in the image of God and that we're called to imitate the solidaristic love practice of Jesus, allows the spirit of liberation to work within, persuade and inspire how we carry out the mission of creation care. This way of thinking is not egalitarian. I want to be clear. I don't think non-human nature, non-human animals is the same as humans. But I do want to recognize that all life has sacred value. This is what I was taught, right? I think this emerges from Black and other indigenous spiritualities. Non-human nature, therefore, is a part of our notion of community. It's very much a part of our way we talk and think about community and what it means to be a part of community. So I'm going to wrap up because I just looked at my slide. I know I'm over, so I apologize. And just speak briefly about these three food ways, these three practices that talk about how we should eat. Soulful eating, justice for food workers, and caring for the earth. Soulful eating asks us, people of faith, committed to an anti-oppressive ethic, to practice what I call an agent-specific and context-specific Black veganism. I recognize that industrial agriculture, particularly factory farms, are built on exploitation of BIPOC folks. If we are to extend compassion towards our marginalized communities, we must opt out of our current food system along multiple fronts, right? We have to opt out of it along multiple fronts. So I want to unpack what I mean by agent-specific and context-specific by saying that I recognize agent-specific means some people can't do it. Growing up, if you read the book, I grew up super poor. We couldn't have done it. It wasn't realistic for us, right? And so I wouldn't expect people to do that. I expect people to have that consciousness when they eat, but not necessarily to be able to practice it. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Context-specific, meaning that some people, for health reasons, can't practice it. That's okay. I don't want to create this hierarchy where people think a certain kind of veganism is, or people say or complain that they have more value because of their diet. There's a clip that I was going to put on here, but I decided to leave out of The Simpsons, where Lisa is a vegan, she meets another vegan, or she's a vegetarian at the time, and he's a vegan, and he says, oh, well, I'm a 5th level vegan, I don't eat anything with a shadow, And like, you have this kind of like way in which people use this to kind of compete. And I'm like, we don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. It's not that, right? It's much more about practice, about becoming. I didn't start out as a vegan. I've continued to grow. My diet has consistently changed. The decolonial theological anthropology goals of solidarity and holistic interconnectedness asks us to work towards ending the oppressive human, non-human animal relationships upon which our current food system thrives. The people who work in those fields, the people who work in those factory farms, and the literal hell they go through. We should not feel good about putting anyone through that kind of work for us to have to be able to eat. And through the practice of Black veganism, we decenter whiteness by making explicit the connection between modern race thinking and the animal. I got this term from Afroism, from this book by my friends Af and Sil Ko. They talk about it by saying they recognize that the blackness of Black veganism is a commitment to an anti-oppressive way of being in the world. It's not about being Black, it's about taking anti-Blackness seriously. I call it a kind of culinary consciousness raising as an ode to Bell Hooks, who talks about opting not to consume. She talks about going to these consciousness-raising meetings for early feminists, how to begin to think critically about what's happening. The same thing happens when we eat. When I say I'm a Black vegan, it brings up conversation to make people think about what it means to explore how white supremacist thinking extends beyond Black bodies and is inclusive of the biotic community, to examine the language of animality and the animal, how it's been used as a tool to justify dehumanization. And what does it look like in practice? I talk so much about cooking. And I'll say a little bit more about that in the conversation that we'll have. And the way cooking, I think, is as a spiritual practice. Justice for Food Workers talks about buying fair trade and local, CSAs and grocery co-ops, becoming politically active, being active in your food policy council or school food programs as a way to address the hidden costs. Rather than focusing on veganism as the kind of pinnacle of what it means, I talk about doing these things collectively, right? taking seriously thinking about churches as food sovereign spaces, meaning to work to eliminate the structural barriers that have displaced grocery stores from BIPOC communities, advocating for raising a minimum wage so people can afford to eat good food, help create food sovereign spaces that can gain more control over our own food supply, building on the legacy of people like Heber Brown and the Black Church Food Security Network, or Fannie Lou Hamer's Freedom Farm Cooperative, who basically kind of lay the groundwork for a lot of the work that Heber is doing. And lastly, caring for the earth. This asks us to take seriously the relationships we have with non-human nature and the land. So practicing caring for the earth promotes the relational affective dimensions of soulful eating through the growing of food that can be prepared in community. So what does it look like? It means taking seriously how we use our land. How might we use our land in ways that actually promotes food sovereignty? We look at the work of Wangari Maathai and the work she did in Africa, what's happening at SoFar Farm in upstate New York, while not religious, while not Christian, I should say, is amazing in the ways they're empowering communities. Princeton, and this is Methodist Theological School of Ohio. That's the school I was talking about, Melanie, is the school I'm affiliated with. Like, this seminary has a farm that teaches, like, clergy how to farm, right? What this actually means for the revitalization of Central Ohio, it's been powerful. So this is what I mean about rethinking how you even use the land here, you know? So that is my presentation. Thank you for the extra 9 minutes. I appreciate it. This is one of the dilemmas of when you're a clergy person is like, I get off script sometimes. I'm like, clock. Ugh. So anyway, thank you so much. Did you want to say something, Gib?
We'll take a 15-minute break to do a little bit of rearranging of the stage here for our next conversation between the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter and the Reverend Melanie Mullen. So please come back, 15 minutes. That's 10:55. Thank you. Testing. Okay. All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started. If you can take your seats. Thank you all for coming back. And welcome to part 2 of this morning. Our discussion between Dr. Carter and Reverend Mullen. And just real quickly on the Reverend Melanie Mullen, also in your program is her bio, but she's a member of Bishop Curry's staff. She supports the Episcopal Church as the Director of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care. And in that role, she's leading the church's work on domestic poverty, Jubilee Ministries, and she shepherds the work of the Episcopal Church staff in relation to racial reconciliation and justice, domestic poverty, and stewardship creation. She's a graduate of the Virginia Theological Seminary with a Master's of Divinity and the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, with a bachelor's degree in history. She grew up in North Carolina. And, you know, I think we're so glad, Melanie, to have you with us because of the work that you're doing and the intersection of that work with what we just heard from the Reverend Dr. Carter, and helping us really think about how we align our practices and bridge the gap that we were talking about earlier between our stated beliefs and our actual practice as people of faith. So rising to the challenge as people of faith, I'll give you both the Reverend Dr. Carter and Reverend Mullen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So glad to be here. Can I first start by saying to you, Dr. Christopher Carter, and to everybody, I love to say I give you greetings on behalf of my boss, Presiding Bishop Michael Curry, who loves the way of creation, care, and justice. So glad we could be here conversating. I know there are little question pads in your pews, and folks will be relaying some questions up, but I had a really, really important question to start off with. What do you have against Martin Luther King? I read the entire book, and there was not one MLK quote. So I thought that was required. But tell me a little bit about, like, where you're coming from and how you are thinking really broadly about this beloved community, this vision of doing justice with food, and not talking about the good Reverend Doctor.
I know, it was I think I hadn't really thought about that until you had mentioned this earlier, and what I realized is that, I guess, I would say there's 2 parts of this. One is a lot of people look at people like King as a kind of moral exemplar, and they will build a whole philosophy or argument from that base. And for me, growing up in a very complicated, my mom by no means was single, but she's been married 4 times, and so I had very fractured relationships with like men in the house, I should say, and this sounds kind of, I don't know, say cheesy, but I would say like I grew up primarily thinking of like Jesus as a much more of a role model in that sense. And so it's so funny because if you'd have asked me this, what am I gonna be when I would never thought I'd be a pastor. But I say things like this, and in hindsight, I'm like, well, maybe it was kind of happening. It's like, it talks a lot about like the way things, how God works, right? And so I think a part of it is my notion of compassion and the way I talk about engaging people comes from those parables and those stories as a way of being human, and that's my foundation. I think a lot of people can, and so I pull nonviolence from Jesus rather than King. And at the same time, the primary, I would say, interlocutor, my conversation partner, is Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman was one of the, so he had, of King. And so if you know anything, like there's a famous story about how King used to always carry around a copy of Jesus and the Disinherited, which if you haven't read, I cannot recommend enough, by Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited. I'm gonna say it one more time. So Thurman influences me so much. And I would say that's probably another reason why is that I think King, well, I know King was drawing on a lot of Thurman's work.
Right.
And so I just straight from the source. And so, yeah, for many of us, King is the way we come to this work because he began, if you look at his speech Beyond Vietnam, for instance, you start seeing he starts drawing these intersections of oppressions between race, class, and the environment, the whole sanitation workers strike. Yep. He's talking about ecology, like he's getting there before he's tragically assassinated. And so a lot of us get there with King, and I think for me, Thurman, growing up in Daytona Beach, Florida, and talking about being in nature and walking on the beach and sensing the sacred reminded me of playing in the woods and being in the woods growing up and having that same experience.
And making it safe to be a spiritual, broadly holistic person, even if you're from an urban background or an African American. Yeah. I
think I was fortunate that even though I grew up kind of it was not like a real city, like Battle Creek, Michigan is like maybe 50 or 60,000 people when I was a kid. So it's not like in my mind, that's a city from where I come from. But my grandparents lived in a rural tiny town of Three Rivers, Michigan, which still only has about 3,000 people in it. And that's where I would spend my summers. And that's where I think for me is where I began to love nature. I began to fall in love with nature.
And you said something unusual that I don't ever really hear in food conversations. You mentioned nonviolence and peace.
Yeah.
When I think about choosing your food choices, the idea of violence doesn't strike me, but I love how you brought up, once again, Thurman and King, bring it all together for us. I mean, 68 in April, Dr. King's last speech was talking about we won't have peace until we understand, I love that phrase, when we eat our breakfast, we've touched on more parts of the colonial world than we would ever realize. And so, we can inhabit that in this really interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so this is one of the, I think, benefits and burdens of being a ethicist. And so, as a trained, philosophical ethicist, the way I think is how can I be morally consistent? And so if I want to say I'm nonviolent with respect to military and the war, well, I can't just stop there. I have to apply it to all aspects of my life. And when I teach this in school, I always tell my students, if we use, for instance, nonviolence as a norm, and by norm I mean just an assumption that we take that influences all our work, most people want to take what I call the norm taxi. And by that I mean, or the norm Uber. We don't take taxis anymore. Norm Uber. They want to say, well, this is my normative belief, but I want it to lead me to certain places. That's not how norms work. Norms are like a bus. You get on the norm, the bus has a route. It's taking you there. And so that's where it's going. And you're just on it. And for me, I was once I made the decision about nonviolence, once I decided to take seriously the realities of oppression of humans and non-human nature and animals, I knew.
You were on the bus.
I was I'm on the bus. I'm gonna be a vegan. I was like, but it wasn't the first stop for me to get off wasn't veganism, right? I had to, I was on the bus for a minute. I had to ride it to get there. But for me, I knew if I wanted to be morally consistent, if I want to stand in front of people as a clergy person and talk about sanctification and talk about growing in Christ and talk about this as a process, I too needed to be authentically going on this journey.
I love that. Authentically going on this journey. On the bus, no matter where it's leading.
And because it's hard. I mean, I want to, whether you're talking about nonviolence or we're talking about food politics or food, justice, it's recognizing that the actions I'm asking y'all to take are the invitations about thinking about some of these concepts and taking them seriously, dealing with race, gender, and class. I'm asking you to reinterpret many assumptions you had about what it means to be human. I don't do that lightly with the expectation that you're going to leave this space and automatically change. I try to do it in a way where it's invitational, where I'm
You're respecting that it is hard.
Yeah.
It sounds like you are the kid who knows what it's like to hide half your food at the family reunion and shove it under the cornbread. When you become a Black vegan, you're already putting on a label on yourself that's I'm going to stand out. I'm going to be different. And so one of the questions up here was how is that received? When you go to the cookout, are people staring at your plate and asking you?
So that's such a great question. I will say I benefit from the privilege of being in Southern California. And so it's so diverse there, and there's so many, I think this would have been harder maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but now veganism, vegetarianism is so ubiquitous, and especially in Southern California because there's a huge, Asian population that many of them practice vegetarianism as a part of their religious practice. If they come from Buddhism or Jainism, there's traditions there that have this.
Yeah.
Like when you fly to India, you have to ask for the meat option on your flight, right? Because the default there is vegetarianism, right? It's default veg. Our default is meat-based protein, right? It doesn't have to be, but that's our default. And that was one of those things where I was like, whoa, wow, this is different, And so for me, I think going into Black spaces back home I was already dealing with the challenge of, I'm the first person in my family to go to college. As I talked about my family, we grew up poor. My mom was I should say something very nice about mothers, not talk about her cooking. My mom was a beauty pageant person, so my mom finished in 4th place for Miss Michigan the year before I was born. And so she was very much about aesthetics and performance. And so I grew up that played a big part of what I thought about what it meant to be Black, was perform certain kind of things. And food and consumption and eating was about similar to that.
Yeah.
Going away to California was for them, this trauma of rejecting my family, rejecting what it meant to, it's I'm going to be around tree, hugging people and granola, and then all of a sudden I started growing dreadlocks, and then they're just I was changing before their eyes in ways that made them uncomfortable. And so then becoming vegan was another layer on top of that. I will say that what made it somewhat easier was when I talked about earlier about my grandmother died. She died in 2005. She was the predominant cook, and so after she died, for those first couple of years while I was still back home in Michigan, we had some gatherings and people just we did potluck style.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the norm. Me becoming vegetarian forced me to learn how to cook, and so when I started going back home to visit, I just volunteered to do the majority of the cooking.
Oh my goodness.
And as a way of not only paying homage to what she did and trying to recreate her recipes, but a way to not have to show them that I'm making things that taste like home.
Yeah.
And so they would eat it, and they thought it was really good, and they didn't want to cook, so they didn't really say much else. they weren't like, oh, I'm going to. They were just like, yeah, this is pretty good. This will work. And so there was still some joking and some ribbing, but not much, I think, So in that sense, I will say my grandfather and my brother, a few people have adopted more of a plant-based diet, but many of them have not. But they don't have an issue with what I eat. They understand why I eat, and they all do consume much less meat.
Right.
As a consequence of what I'm talking about. Or my mother lives in Tennessee, what meat she does consume comes from the farmer who lives down the road.
Right.
And so it's just it's changed. The conversations we've had have been an invitation to change rather than an invitation to judgment. And that's been and I think it started with cooking, because they ate it and they're like, oh.
Because cooking is that holy act of sort of remembering the story. I love the recipes.
Oh, thank you.
Citrus collards, that's going to be different for me.
It is
And
different.
sharing them.
It is different, but I'm telling you, it's good, man. I knew and these lectures that I give, normally when I give a book lecture, I've been asking people to prepare some of the things that I make, some of the recipes to serve while I'm talking. And I gave a lecture at the University of California, Irvine. There's a lady in the audience who is from Hammond, Louisiana, which is where my dad is from. And she put all the food in these tiny little bowls because she wanted to taste each of them separately to make sure, Black woman. She was like, I want to just, because she was she didn't believe it was going to taste the way it was supposed to taste in her mind. And so she ate all the food, she ate it, and then she waited to the end of my lecture, and it was the public Q&A. Raised her hand. She was like, and she told me where she was from and why she did what she did. And she's like, I came in here with the belief that this was not going to taste good, and I was going to tell you this isn't soul food. But then I ate it, and I was like, man, this is good. And
Tasted her eyes were
Yeah,
open.
it's like the scales fell off, man. It was just like, whoa. And so it was, and it's those moments that give me a sense of joy,
Yes.
where I'm like, I'm able to help people see another way. Because I don't want to shame anyone, but I want to invite them to recognize that the foods we eat have always been porous. They've always evolved.
Porous. Okay.
It's just like,
Right. And it's like you almost describing soul food as it's a type of liturgy for us. It's the sharing of narrative. It's reframing and knowing that we're loved in our history and our traditions. But what if you have no soul food background?
yeah.
Are there ways in which there's foods that all Southerners like certain types of
Oh,
foods?
yeah.
No
Yeah,
matter
yeah,
what your
yeah,
ethnic
yeah.
background, are there ways in which whatever food you bring can be a part of this holy act of being ethically compassionate, kind, and in solidarity?
Yeah. I think, so what I did in my church service, so I talked about my book last week in my own church, because I hadn't done that yet, and I was keep missing these Sundays to go talk about my work at another church, so I thought I probably should do it at my own church. What I invite people to do is to have a conversation where they think about a particular kind of meal they ate growing up that was meaningful. So I invite them to go back into their own memories. Like, what was meaningful about these meals? What did you eat? What was sacred about it? And so I invite them to sit in that space and kind of go back and literally remember, put themselves in that place. And then we start breaking it down around why was that sacred?
Yeah.
What were you eating? What stories are being told? To help people understand that, again, food tells a story. All of us have stories that we've carried with us from our ancestors that's often centered around meals, and it's a part of our identity.
Could be the sacred tostadas or the sacred collards.
Well, one of and this is, it's a sad story, but it's a powerful story. One of my students, so I have my students in my food and religion class do a project where they do a 5-minute Food Network cooking style video, where they cook a recipe and they talk about where it came from and how it came to be in their family and all this other kind of stuff. And they talk about it with respect to the religious framework identified in the video. And one of my students is Jewish, and he was making this thing with his mother. And it was simple egg and bread dish. But it was something their grandmother had to eat while she was basically on the run in Central Europe during World War II. And so they start telling the story during the video, and the mother starts crying because she's remembering her mother eat this stuff. And the whole class, everybody started, everybody's crying. I'm almost starting to cry now because I remember you just it was, so it doesn't have to be complex.
Yeah.
It is that story, right? It's the ways in which there's something that's passed down that allows us to reconnect, right? To those ancestors whose shoulders we stand on. And so I think we all, while we don't necessarily bring the traditions of soul food with us, we all have food and food ways that tell us stories that inform our identities. How can we embrace those in ways that can bring about love and compassion and in ways that don't harm?
Totally. You mentioned that a lot of Jewish siblings of ours in ministry and mission really get this idea of food justice around rituals, sharing stories. I mean, we're all Episcopalian. We've known take the bread, break it, and give it out, and recreating this little bit of way, this holiness. And one of my favorite lines is, "What you're about to eat, you become what you are." I love this holiness of this act of sharing this food, and that your students were in tears.
Yeah, and I think, particularly when you think about the Eucharist, one of the parts of the liturgy that I always say is I remind people that, when the disciples were eating in the upper room, when they would have Passover, they tell the story of the liberation from Egypt, but they tell the story in a way that puts them in the story, right? It's so they're we come from this story has informed who we are, and we also place ourselves in the story of redemption. Right? So where do we place ourselves in our story of redemption as Christians when we're talking about living out this kind of Eucharistic solidarity? And so that is a part of that tradition that I'm trying to help us remember. Right?
And you mentioned also retelling the story in the right way, because I love how you brought in this very complex thing of systemic impression.
Yeah.
It's about telling the truth and retelling the story. And we talk about beloved community in the Episcopal Church a lot. We're becoming a beloved community. We're walking a labyrinth, using the Martin Luther King's phrases. But some of that work is telling an honest truth and then teaching ourselves to do something differently. So perhaps in our food choices, we are still doing that work.
Yeah, and I think this is where, again, I mean, Gib has set the standard high for people who do my introductions. Because, you know, like I said, that line he quoted, like, I'm serious. Like, that was, like, one of the last things I wrote, and I was like, and it resonated with me because because of the journey I had to go on with my own diet, you know, and this idea of that's where our humanness is. Like, you know, this is a process. And so you just want to acknowledge that this is something that we are working towards. And while we are to move towards perfection, we recognize that it's impossible for us to be perfect.
Some generosity,
yeah. You know, and so for me, that's been an informative part of my own thinking of how I try to live out these food practices. So, yeah.
Yeah, one of the questions kind of relates to that is, I mean, you're talking about this charitableness, this new posture, and having compassion for people, but then how does one have compassion for animals in our food choice theme? And I want to add, what if I'm not quite ready to be vegan?
Yeah.
Like, you know, I might like my fried fish or something.
And so I said, this isn't in the book, and I hadn't really thought about how relevant it was until I started doing the book tours. I grew up obviously eating meat, but I am allergic to seafood. And so I grew up with a food restriction my whole life. And being from Louisiana, my people being, and not being, exactly. So now you see, like, where certain things where people had to either make a separate dish for me or there's certain things I just could not eat. You know, like if we just did. And so I've always had this realization of having somewhat of a different diet, but also recognizing that restriction doesn't mean like alienation, right? If I'm restricting myself from certain things my community eats, I'm still black just because I can't eat the way they make dirty rice like that. You know, and so and so I think that what I want to invite people to consider with respect to the transition or the process, and I want to get back to the question you asked about animals, but with respect to veganism, for me, it wasn't I didn't become vegan because of the animals. I like animals. My wife's a veterinarian. Animals are great. It was tied to the realities of what happens in factory farms and the way it harms people. That's it.
Yeah.
It was because most people work in those spaces are people of color. Most of them are immigrants. And now, unfortunately, there's an influx of child labor in these places.
Wow.
That is just super scary. Sarah Sanders Huckabee, or whatever, Huckabee Sanders, she signed legislation a few weeks ago that basically makes it easier for underage workers to work in places like this. Arkansas. And so, like, that's the reality of what's happening. And
we can eat food that's surrounded in choices of death.
Yes.
Right.
We can be very much complicit in this, space. And so for me, I was like, I need to do my best to opt out of it. Like, it was, I didn't want to be as wrapped up in that kind of human oppression. And recognizing that those factories also have so much pollution that harm the communities who live next to those plants, and most of those communities are communities of color.
Yes.
And so, like, so I guess I say all this to say, like, I'm going to talk about animals because I like animals. I love animals. Animals are great. But this is a much more of an anthropocentric approach to veganism than anything else.
Yes, yeah.
But it doesn't mean that animals or non-human nature doesn't have value or worth, or that their suffering doesn't matter. It's just a different suffering.
Well, I think that's important, like when you were mentioning the people who don't want to call themselves vegan.
Yeah.
Because it's associated with the tulpa culture. But the fact is, like, if we love God's people and don't want to leave anyone behind, we love the food that they're eating, and we love the health and care. And you put up on that slide Smithfield, North Carolina, where my grandparents are from. And I remember that we had to delay my grandmother's funeral because of commercial hog farming. Because of climate change and industrial practices, there was a flood that wouldn't let us bury. And so we got it. Like, barbecue's a part of life for us. But the way that we want to engage with animals needs to be health for humans as well. So, I mean, yeah, I think there's like space to help us all be loving.
Yeah, and I think, one of the players that played football at the University of San Diego is from Smithfield. And is to recognize that, and I had to actually fight the editors to keep the Bible in the book, because like most people who publish religious texts, biblical scholars write about the Bible, and theologians take that and like add it to other stuff. But coming from a black church context, like the Bible matters. I had to, if I didn't talk about what the Bible says, because it's about things that didn't give me the kind of credibility to go in that space. And so for me, being able to read those narratives and say, oh, when you look at it in Hebrew, when you look at it in its language that was written in, what you see is a story that's all about relationships. That's about relationships with nature, about relationships with animals, and about and again, that's why I said it's a limited freedom, and that's why I kept going back to I'm like, was the challenge is God tells them you can be free and you can have all this stuff, but I'm going to place some limits around your freedom.
Right.
And like,
sounded like Paul.
and like this is, and again, the rhetoric that we hear right now with what I would call the like growing Christian nationalist rhetoric are people who want to have a limitless freedom of guns, a limitless freedom of capitalism, a limitless freedom for like anything.
Right.
Because they see any kind of restriction of freedom as infringing upon their individual selves rather than recognizing the collective good and solidarity, which is which is the vision in the beloved community in the garden. And so I'm like, there's a lot we can pull from that text that should inform us if we read it in ways that don't come with that colonial lens, and so that's, for me, is like that's the language that I begin to borrow from when I'm talking about caring for nature and caring for animals, because it's tied to our own well-being. Like, it's deeply, like, if you care about humans, you then ought to care about nature and animals, and when we start thinking about those things separately and forget that we're animals and forget that we're part of the biotic community, that's when we develop and move into having serious ecological problems that we're dealing with today.
It is tied to our own well-being, right? I think we're set up for pieces of this.
Yeah.
I bet you everybody in here knows the response when you think about, if all creation is part of our neighbor, will you seek to serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself?
Yeah.
Somebody's going to say it? See? Yeah. I mean, like, we're already set up to love the neighbor, so to think of the neighbor as all of these parts of creation, maybe including the animals too. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, like, but what's also, I think, challenging for us, and I shouldn't generalize because I don't know who here grew up on a farm.
Farms?
But because like the people who read, like the majority of people who read what we now call the Bible come from an agrarian community. There are so many farming metaphors all throughout the text. Another book I would recommend is Scripture, Culture, Agriculture by a professor at Duke Divinity School whose name's escaped me. Yeah, there you go. So you already know. And I think what she helps makes explicit in that is the ways in which they would have read it with that kind of knowledge and assumptions already in place. Mm-hmm. Because we have been so urbanized, we've further distanced ourselves from the reality that they would have understood to be true.
Right.
Yeah. And so some of this is it's a problem of a modern problem. And then on top of that, you deal with the issues of like the legacy of like the trauma of enslavement by certain communities, right? Black folks, like the ways in which many of us can look at agriculture as a step backwards. Right?
Interesting.
As a step backwards in terms of our progress towards liberation, we can say, this is, we want to leave that behind. And the same thing with
distance, it disempowers us. Even if you're thinking historically, a step
Yeah.
away from, we get to the point where we understand farm to table as being like a restaurant practice, and you think beef is a thing that comes wrapped in plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that historical telling is what we're supposed to do. The beloved community is about re-walking the path and telling a truthful history.
Yeah, when I talk to my family, like that as my grandpa's generation, about what they ate, it was just, even though they were poor, they ate better than I did when I was a kid because they were on farms. Like, it was like you don't get fresher food than what they were eating.
Wow.
Whether it be animal proteins or not, and there wasn't a lot of animal proteins because they just didn't have money. And so I think, again, it's those narratives, those stories that we choose to tell shape our thinking, about our activism and who we are. And so it's more about reclaiming these stories in ways that actually lead towards a nonviolent, loving presence and practice, rather than telling a story in a way that's more about individualism and consumerism.
So to eat in a way that is liberating, life-giving, and loving.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about love. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
One thing, I know you got another question, but one thing I want to make sure I sufficiently answer the question about people who are like hesitant or reluctant to make the journey towards veganism and vegetarianism. I think that my experience has been, once you begin to start thinking this way, it's only a matter of time. It's it's only a matter of time, because it just sticks in your mind. But I said that to say, I prefer to think of eating and cooking as a spiritual practice, meaning that it's a process of learning and becoming. And so, you can't just stop eating one way and immediately be okay. You have to, develop the skills to learn how to cook and prepare the foods that feel and taste good to you in different kinds of ways. But you have to be committed to doing that discipline. And so I'd invite people to just make the commitment to okay, I'm going to, for every breakfast is going to be vegetarian, or every lunch, and just do that kind of practice, and it'll eventually get you to the place where you are comfortable with making that kind of decision. And so that's how that's how it worked for me. And I found that to be that was an effective process. It gave me some grace to not feel like I need to be.
It's not a exercise in perfectionism.
No.
I love this. We have a lot of questions.
That's great. Thank you.
I love this, thinking about, how do you feel about, and once again, we're talking about these phrases. You mentioned, was it fork to field?
Yeah, from field to fork, yep.
Also these things about regenerative farming, organic. What are all of these phrases out either telling us about really living ethically?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I'm actually going to do a presentation, and I got invited to a conference put on by the Vatican. So I'm going to be leaving in June to go to Italy to do a presentation on regenerative agriculture. And I would argue that...
What is that? Explain it to me.
So regenerative agriculture is basically trying to actually grow food in ways that doesn't use chemicals and pesticides, that actually regenerates the soil. It takes seriously the life of the soil and grow food in a way that actually is regenerative, which is consistent with the ways in which, quite honestly, indigenous communities in America grew food before colonialism. Most of the way we grow food now is to pump the soil full of chemicals so that we can produce monocrops that we can therefore sell on a global market. And so it's a fundamentally different way. It's a going backwards to a kind of ancient, really just a few hundred years ago knowledge that many communities had. And I would say we do have to be somewhat careful around what we might call humane washing, in terms of how people use certain labels to say something that doesn't really mean anything.
Greenwashing.
Yeah. And so you gotta you have to be careful and kind of do some research around the organization you're buying things from. Because for instance, I know there's a lawsuit right now against Whole Food for selling meat that they claim to be antibiotic free that actually had antibiotics in it. So many may not know that. And so and they were told that it had antibiotics in it and they should stop selling it, and they continued to sell it. And so now there's a class action suit. I was invited to be on one of the, I don't know, it's one of those things where I still don't consider myself as this kind of expert, and they're like, oh, we want you to be this expert person and write something. I'm just I don't know. I was I don't want to get involved in any kind of lawsuit, but anyway, I think that, terms I would say anything that comes about that's talking about regenerative agriculture, I think is consistent with a kind of holistic vision of respecting the life of the soil, that's seeing the microbes and biomes of the earth as alive, as teeming with life.
It's almost an Easter Sunday kind of farming.
That's what I'm literally going to say.
Soil, you give that the name Adam, the Adamai, in the Bible.
It's alive.
Dirt.
And it's alive, man. And this is...
It's going to regenerate.
And we talk about this, Scripture, you look at Psalms talking about how nature responds to God, right? The rocks cry out, mountains move. It takes seriously that reality.
Rocks do cry out.
It's alive. And so that's what I love about that form of agriculture. I would say that it is, it's a going, I'll say this because I know I can ramble. I apologize if I'm rambling right now. But I want to tell this quick story about when my grandfather, in the tiny town that he grew up in, they started selling organic food in like 2008, with things that were labeled organic. And so he called me, and he's like, Christopher, you know, I'm at the grocery store, and they have these tomatoes, and they're labeled organic tomatoes. He's like, what is that? And I was like, oh, you know, Grandpa, that means they're grown without, you know, chemicals. Because he grew because he had this is the 1 year he didn't have his farm, because he had sold his house, moved to a condo before he bought some more land to grow his own food. So he had never really bought produce at the grocery store.
Some side garden.
Yeah. So he was like, fine. So this is the 1 year he had to like do this stuff at the store. And he was like, okay, what's this mean? And so I tell him, I'm like, oh, it's grown without chemicals, pesticides. It has to meet particular kind of standards. It may have a little bit on there, but not too much. And he's like, oh, so it just means normal. He's like, it's like normal. And I was like, yeah, I guess it does.
Organic means
Normal. And so then he was like, well, why don't they label the other stuff? See, that's other, like, he's like, why don't they label the other stuff as not normal? And I was just like, and so my grandpa only has maybe at best a third grade education, because he was working. He didn't learn how to read till he was an adult. But he has a particular kind of wisdom that, you know, that can only be acquired through life.
Right.
That only is acquired through life. And so, you know, that story didn't make it into the book, but it's a story that I've told frequently because I think it encapsulates the ways in which we use labels to, it's kind of like I talked about the Anthropocene. Like, we can say things in a way that doesn't hold us accountable for what's actually happening. You know, and so like we use labels like organic to hide the fact that we actually put a lot of poison on food that we think of as normal.
And to hide the fact that the way God intends this world to be, this kingdom of God, is one that is normal, as your grandfather would say.
Yeah.
Life-giving, healthful.
Yeah.
It's up for us to learn the wisdom to turn that around.
Yeah, no, it definitely challenges our assumptions around what is and isn't.
I want to start going to the grocery store saying, is this normal? I want the normal.
It's a normal orange.
Well, there's a few more questions, and this is really interesting. I never thought about this. Number one, do you miss eggs and cheese? But I want to wrap it into another question. What should churches be feeding people? What should churches be feeding people? And I guess that could mean socially, but also maybe what we're giving out.
I think, yeah.
Charity, yeah.
I love that question. I don't miss eggs and cheese, but I didn't really I think, you know, I grew up with a slight, lactose intolerance too, which I shouldn't even say, that's pretty normal for most people of color. The majority of the world actually doesn't process lactose. Most Europeans can process lactose. And so the whole idea of being lactose intolerant is really an inverse of the reality. I'm more lactose normal. And but anyway, what I do miss, so the craziest thing is when I decided to make, and this is totally going to buy into the stereotypes or fit into the stereotypes, but it is what it is. My wife and I moved to out of Claremont, where I was going to grad school, to Pasadena for a year before we moved back. And this is the year we became vegetarian. And we happened to live a block away from a fried chicken restaurant. And I was like, this is the dumbest decision I made to try to go.
The grease and goodness.
Every day I would go outside and I'll be like, ugh. And so I think for me, you know, my grandmother's fried chicken was the hardest thing for me. And again, I think if she was still alive, I would have a hard time. That would have made it harder, I'll be honest, because that was her signature dish. I have learned to make substitutes that are vegan that have the flavor, but it's different. And so that is, you know, so it's to say that there are certain things you miss, right? There's certain things you miss. But to me, that's a compromise or sacrifice you're willing to make for the goodness of what you have collectively.
Well, let me ask you about your neighborhood. If you live in a neighborhood where the best thriving business is the fried chicken restaurant, hopefully you're in a place where you can make a choice. I don't need that. But if you're in a really underserved neighborhood and the only business that isn't a liquor store is the fried chicken restaurant, it goes back to the question of what do we feed those for whom there's limited choices? Or, I mean, how do you help people?
I think we have to start asking a different question. The question we need to ask ourselves is, why do they have limited choices?
Right.
They didn't choose to live in that place that only has limited choices.
That's true.
Right? And so we start with the assumption, well, what about these people who only have this? Well, why do we make it okay for those people to only have that choice? What systems have you put in place, redlining, that has made it such that people are living in these spaces where they only have these limited choices? I would argue that a better question is, how might we empower this community to not only give them the opportunity to make more money so they can afford better food, but to create, again, food sovereign spaces so they have access to different foods. Yes,
Sovereign space.
while they're there, this is what they have to eat. But we need to be about changing that circumstance rather than saying and trying to justify their choices, right? And I think that, again, because that puts us in a position of accountability. How do we, and we did this in Compton. So I'm saying this from a space of having done this, of building a network of small co-ops that become a large co-op, starting a Sunday afternoon, which now is twice a week, farmers market. Like, you can do this. Like, this is not, it is about collaboration between religious communities and nonprofits that are committed to having self-determination through food. And so I think we have to ask different questions, because that comes from a kind of saviorist standpoint. Oh, what are they going to do? Well, how do they end up this way?
Right.
It's the why. Why are things like this, right?
Here.
And if we don't ask that question, then we're not taking seriously the past that has put us in this position, right?
Yes.
Sorry,
No,
that is a question that, because that was, growing up food insecure, that was me. I was in that community. And, we were in that community because my mom, had to work 2 or 3 jobs so we could afford to be poor. My mom worked at a hotel, and the reason we had breakfast is because she worked overnight, and she would take breakfast from the hotel home so we could eat. And then we eat school lunch. And then we didn't eat a damn thing else until the following morning.
Wow.
And,
Wow.
it didn't have to be this way. But that was my reality.
Yes.
And, no one bothered to ask why.
And for us, the people of God, the people of the Jesus movement of church, we want to get away from doing 4 or doing 2 people without food, and I think being in solidarity with, doing with. But that means, like you said, asking those big questions. Those are hard questions.
It's hard because it makes us feel bad.
Why is it that there's only one food choice in this neighborhood?
Yeah, and it makes us feel bad. Like I said, that's why I talked about doing the U-turn rather than saying,
The U-turn.
oh, I don't want to feel bad. Well, why does this point make me feel this particular way, right? I think that is much more. You see, I think this is. Going back to this is partly because we just finished Easter, so I'm remembering Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's like, "Take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours." Right? You see Jesus doing this internal work in the moment, right? He's like, "I don't want to die, but not my will, yours be done. Give me the courage to do the thing that I know you've called me to do."
Are you implying that something as simple as running this parish food pantry involves internal work? Bravery?
And courage?
We'd have a lot less volunteers for a food pantry.
Well,
you have to be brave, and you have to be prayerful and think things through.
You have to talk to the people that you serve. Yeah, all those kinds of things. Whoever asked that question, thank you. And please don't. I hope you weren't offended by my answer. But it definitely it brings me back to my own experience and the challenge I felt like when people don't ask. When people get stuck on the what and they don't ask the why.
They don't ask the why. I love that. I know you have showed us pictures sometimes of your adorable little one.
Yes.
So how do you teach all of this in words like Anthropocene to those coming out of the soil, the next generation?
That's such a great question. And in part because it's a practice of translation. My son's 4. I like to think he's smart for 4, but every parent likes to think their kid is smart for the age they are. And so we talk about doing things that's good for the earth, and I use that language we don't run the water because you got to be good for the earth. We got to be good for the planet. But more than anything, it's about demonstrating a way of being that respects that respects life, And so, I mean, he's vegan, but he doesn't know that he is. We talk about he eats stuff that's what we
He
eat.
doesn't know he's vegan.
Damn, no.
He
Like
says he
he
respects-
knows, like if you ask him what's chicken, he would tell you, like he would show you something that's like Gardein or something like that, like real chicken. Like he would tell you what a chicken is, but he knows that's not the chicken you eat.
Okay.
He knows the distinction between like that's chicken, but you don't eat that chicken. You eat this other chicken, because it's life. And this I should say is the benefit of having a spouse that's a veterinarian. My son is also exposed to animals in a way that most kids probably aren't. Because once you're in a neighborhood, if you are a veterinarian and people find out you're a veterinarian, somehow people conveniently can walk by your house
With all the animals?
with their animals and be like, it's somehow, like it's just eventually the word gets
Like
out.
Noah's Ark. You're just
It is actually. That's basically what it is. And so, so he loves animals. He's learning about that. I would say the best, and so one of the things I do, in addition to modeling behavior with respect to, like, even, this made me think of, I should show you this video of my son talking about garbage and recycling and different things that go in different spaces. Like we just talk about it. And it's kind of informal and kind of formal, but it's just part of the conversation. And also involve him in cooking. I told this story yesterday. I got profiled for a magazine in San Diego, and the people asked me, "Oh, do you have any pictures of you cooking?" And I was like, "I don't. I do most of the picture taking in my family. My wife hasn't taken a picture of me cooking. No." And my wife was finishing her residency, so she was working all the time. So I didn't even want to bother her with this. But I was like, I do have pictures of my son cooking with me. And so I sent them pictures of my son, like one picture. They're like, "Oh, that's great. Do you have a few more?" So I sent them like 2 other pictures of him, and I had like videos and stuff like that. And so the magazine profile is 1 picture of me and 4 pictures of my son. They were just like, "Oh, it's adorable. Look at his son doing this. It was the funniest thing." And I was like, so it's like, it's a profile of me, but not really, and like, but when I'm doing that, I talk about, like, one of the videos we're making, the red beans and rice, that's a homage to my grandmother. And, in the video, like, I'm talking to Isaiah about his great-grandmother that he's not ever get a chance to meet. And I just talk about what she would do and how she was. And so, like, I just try to tell stories. And I know some people will find that, like, it's inconvenient to do that. It does take more time. I would say it's valuable time that you get that has meaning. But also, he loves being involved. And because we've practiced it, he has his own, he wants to help. Like, it's not like, he doesn't want to be in the way. Like, he wants to help.
Yeah.
And that's been a beautiful thing.
That's how we craft the path to justice. I mean, once again, going back to that beloved community, we tell a truth, but then we also practice in formation in church speak the way of Jesus.
Yeah.
So you're modeling again and again.
What were you guys talking about the Sunday school practice? What was that program called?
Sacred ground? Or?
No, the Godly play.
Play.
That's what it is. It's godly play. That's what it is. I was like, oh, it's godly play. I hadn't thought about it until somebody mentioned it yesterday. I was like, oh, wow, I guess that is kind of what we're doing.
Inhabiting this life-giving relationship to food and love. Oh, my goodness, I love that.
Oh.
Well, another thing, I know, like, all the kids here are engaged right now in some planting and getting ready for bees and doing these activities of small-scale farming and urban farming. But how then do we explicitly make that connection? We love the tomato plants, but to turn that into an awareness of, now, where does our food come from? How is there food inequity? The big justice words. Like, how do you walk from just, I love butterflies, to let's remember what we have to eat and how we're all connected and some folks don't have, or some folks have to work hard to put food on our plates?
I think you have to an extent, you have to judge. It's almost on I won't say case-by-case basis, but it's definitely contextual on how aware your particular children are. Mm-hmm. And so, like, if you're in a community where the only people of color you see are the people who are landscapers and who work in grocery stores, their perception of people of colors and their relationship to them is going to be as people who...
Servant helpers for you all the time, yeah.
And so then you need to be more vigilant about the kind of conversations you have, about what people look like and how people are, and ask them questions. I think we can't, I have found as a teacher, I don't always have to be like the sage, as the expression goes, sage on the stage. I ask questions about what do you see and why do you think you see it. 'Cause they are smart enough to, they will start putting some things together.
What do you see?
And like, why is that? Why do you think the only black people we see work at the store? Like, that's strange. And then just let it sit. We don't always have to answer everything right away. Give them time to think and to wrestle with it. And it's going to come back up. And then when you have those moments to begin to raise the question again, like, I'm wondering, remember we talked about this. I'm wondering if you thought about that anymore. And find ways to make it a part of, not where you just have to hammer them over the head. I don't think that's helpful. But you integrate it into the flow of what's happening when you're going to the grocery store. You know, you integrate it into the flow of what's happening when you're cooking. And then as they're older, I would say if you have a high school student, that's when you really should be talking about much more of these issues on a structural level.
Right.
I think because if they go to public school, I shouldn't say public or private. I have a frustration with education right now, which is part of the reason why I left, because of the ways in which they're trying to promote a kind of what I would call historical amnesia. You know, a telling of the past that doesn't take seriously the past. And so, like, you have to have a counter to that so they actually know about this. And in California, you see this explicitly done with indigenous communities and Asian communities, where you have, like, they don't talk seriously about the Japanese, like, essentially being interned and being put in, like, concentration camps, even though they still exist. And they don't talk about take seriously the ways in which we have these indigenous communities put into these, what do they call them?
Interments? And
Yeah, basically the way in which they stole kids from their parents.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so, like, these are things they don't talk about. They just like, oh, these Catholic priests did this amazing work. And like,
sanitizing our history.
yeah, and so let's just be honest about what happened. And again, why do you think that happened? You know? Give them the space to begin to process rather than just, like, force feeding everything to them. But you want to make sure they are thinking about it, because they are going to they're learning about race whether or not you're teaching them about it or not. They're learning about equity whether or not you explicitly talk about it or not.
Yep.
So you want to be consistent and explicit, but you don't want to, I would argue, come across as over the top, coming down on them, because I would say that turns anybody off if you feel like someone's just...
But that rootedness in the stories of the soil, once again, is like the antidote, hopefully, to that amnesia. The idea that the numbness is going to be fed all around us to not knowing our history. Another thing you mentioned, though, is also all of the animals coming to your house, like the proximity. You know, I love, like, some of my favorite community organizers talk about there is no change until you can see your neighbor.
Yeah.
And your kid sees animals. Or, you know, if we see the garden, we see something about this. That's the source of our being to have our eyes open.
I agree. And, like, relationship matters. And one of the things I talk so much about race and xenophobia is relationship. And I think...
Right relationship.
You know, I think, you know, like, I do believe... I talk about the work that I do as a form of healing, rather than people use the term bridge building. I think bridge building as a metaphor implies people are still going to be in their separate spaces, and they come together and they go back to their separate spaces. I'm going to talk about the reality of American history as having a lot of wounds that eventually need to be able to heal those wounds, there will be a scar. That scar, there will be evidence of the trauma of the past that will not go away. But that evidence doesn't mean that our relationship needs to be rooted in that trauma. Rather, it shows us what we've had to work through to overcome to get to where we are.
I love that.
And so it's about healing that particular kind of trauma, and recognizing that that collectively, like, if we, you know, taking seriously, you know, Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, I think it's 13 is the love one, maybe it's 12, where he talks about the body and how we're all a part of the body of Christ, and he uses the metaphors. And just taking that seriously, like, we all can't be an eye. We're not all supposed to be a foot. You know, but if we are a part of the body, we recognize we have a part to play, and that all parts have value, right? And so just taking, and, you know, Paul got some problematic things he got in there, right? Let's be honest, you know, like you know, Paul is human. Paul comes from a class privilege that Jesus did not have. Paul was a Roman citizen.
Yes.
Right? So we have to take that seriously. Like, Jesus is a Jesus was a Palestinian Jew growing up in Roman-occupied Palestine who didn't have the privileges of power that Paul has.
Right. You had a different relationship to empire.
And so that totally makes sense when you read those texts in those ways.
Job to do. Yeah.
Fundamentally different jobs.
Yeah.
And so I've eased up on my Pauline critique, I think, as I have come to understand his role and what he's trying to do, and also the evolution that I think people don't give him credit for in what he's saying.
In our wise old years, we learned that we too have a lot of dimensions to understand with Paul. But I love this, like, I'm going to start saying this, that it's not bridge building, but healing. Because healing does lose space for those wounds, which last Sunday we all heard, I want to examine the wounds.
Yeah.
The hands and the feet. Jesus had wounds, we can have them too.
And I think it allows us to acknowledge our history rather than, like, again, trying to have that historical amnesia. And I think so many people feel like, especially white people, want to, like, say, well, the way we can move past the past is to just not talk about it. And if any of us are in a relationship, if you're in a partner relationship, that's a terrible idea. That doesn't work, to not talk about the past.
No.
To pretend it didn't happen. Like we
tried that.
Yeah, we know that
Didn't work really
it doesn't work. And so, like, you know that you have to acknowledge it, and it's going to come up in conversations. But if you've actually done the work, the reconciliation work to heal that, it can just be a part of your story, but not the part of your story. It's a part of a broader story that you're writing.
So is there such a thing as food reconciliation, or?
Oh, wow. I would say my initial thoughts of hearing that brings me to thinking about indigenous communities and the ways in which their diets have been. One of my friends, or I shouldn't call him a friend, an acquaintance, is known as the Sioux chef, like Sioux with the indigenous tribe, Sioux.
The Sioux
Chef.
next chef.
And he talks about how the fact there isn't any, you don't see any indigenous cuisine restaurants. You don't see indigenous fast food places. Why is that? These were the people who were, so when we, in our food studies program at USD, when you take your initial class on food studies and food history, it's taught by our indigenous scholar and ethnic studies program. It starts with indigenous foodways, because that's authentically American, quote unquote, foodways. And so when I think about food reconciliation, it's about, it takes seriously the reality of the displacement of indigenous communities and the displacement of their foodways, and how can we allow them to re-inhabit their foodways in ways that actually allow them to have life and life abundant. And I shouldn't say allow, empower them. And because they have suffered a tremendous amount because of the trauma of empire, right? And so yes, I think food reconciliation takes seriously food sovereignty. And I think with poor communities, food reconciliation is going to be, again, I use the term food apartheid, and that's probably, some of you probably familiar with that, rather than food deserts, because food apartheid takes seriously, this is a political act. There's a reason. Redlining is why we have these spaces, why these places don't have food.
Food deserts implies it's a naturally occurring phenomenon.
Yeah, this isn't natural.
Food
Apartheid. Like, this is done
Yes.
to people. This is done to communities. And rural communities, which can be predominantly black, but still very, very white, very racially integrated, suffer as much as any other communities. And they're the people who grow the food, they don't have access to the food, right? And, like, that's the stuff that is, the people that are working and growing our food are some of the people starving. One of the gentlemen we were talking about this earlier, right? Like, that doesn't make, it should not be. It's like that should not be. And so reconciliation to me begins in those spaces. I love that you asked that question, though. Now that's definitely,
We're gonna borrow that.
I'm like, yeah, that's great. I appreciate that.
I think this will put us at a place, and I love this question, whoever answered it, of really thinking in the Easter tradition and where we should land. You said we are in the process of becoming. But at what point in all of our foodways, reparations, reconciliation work, and sovereignty, when can we start to celebrate that we've actually accomplished something?
I think there's room for celebration anytime we know as they say in my tradition, anytime we recognize that we've made a way out of no way.
That's right.
That's the kind of language we use. And so anytime you have those moments where you've been able to, start a new program, been able to maybe feed more people than you historically otherwise have been able to, when you've galvanized your community to do something with respect to food justice that they hadn't thought about doing.
Amen.
Those are the moments we need to celebrate. You have to have joy, in the midst of this, because I think that allows us to cultivate hope. Like, hope is like the midpoint between despair and presumption, right? Like, you don't want to be in a space of thinking nothing's ever going to work out and just live in despair. You don't want to presume that science is going to solve all our problems. Like, that's not, history tells us that's definitely not what's going to happen, right? So hope takes seriously the realities that we are in. It takes seriously the fear that we might have of food insecurity, and allows us to work through that fear to envision something better. We work towards that because we know we don't want that fear to be realized. That's what we hope for, to avoid that negative consequence. And in so doing, in the process of living into that hope, we have to have those moments of celebratory joy when we accomplish something that we had not accomplished. And I think for me, when I wrote this book and I finished it, and I gave my grandfather the hardback copy, where in the beginning is dedicated to him. And I was like, this is your testament. You didn't get a chance to go to school. You worked to allow me to be where I am. You got our family out of generational poverty. This is your testament. That's the stuff for me that we celebrate. And that is what I think gives me, and what gave him hope, and what gives me hope for what Isaiah may be able to do. So yeah, thank you for asking that question. That is a good place, probably a good place for me to stop talking for a minute, at least while I rub my eyes and get the tears out.
I think for all of us, you've left us with this prayer of a hope that is joy, a hope that is grandma's greens, a hope that is breaking the cornbread of racial justice, a hope that has children knowing that life in earth is regenerative and meant for all. I cannot thank you enough for helping us walk this beloved community way. And may we all keep working towards a vision of justice that we can call Hope Jesus.
Yeah, thank you for these questions. These were amazing questions too.
Oh my gosh.
Thank you both. Thank you both so much. What a fantastic session, and really great way to now go into some physical nourishment with some food that has been prepared by Equinox Restaurant for us. As Laura explained earlier, go out these doors, turn right, and then turn left, and correction, go out these doors, turn left, go across the street, and the lunch will be served there. Thank you again, Melanie and Christopher.